This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge Co. As the editor and publisher of The Nation, the country's oldest political weekly magazine, Katrina vanden Heuvel is a passionate progressive. She writes on the state of American politics in the magazine and in the Washington Post newspaper. Many of her columns appear in a new book called The Change I Believe In, Fighting for Progress in the Age of Obama, and she's my guest. So I know this is a question you most likely have to answer all the time, but what's the difference between a progressive and a liberal?
You know, I think the main difference is the belief, progressives believe more in the power of ordinary people to self-organize, to speak in their own voice, whereas I think liberals have often had more of a top-down approach. There's not as much trust in the people to manage their own lives and their business. But on the other hand, I'm all for rehabilitating the term liberal. And I just wish that, I think part of the problem with liberals is that too often they haven't taken their own side in the argument. Yeah. And they've let themselves be rolled over and not made the case for what liberalism has accomplished in our history.
Exactly. The
kind of civilizing advances that we're seeing not many, but some would like to roll back. Child labor laws.
Right, I mean, unbelievable, Social Security,
yeah.
The whole thing. I consider myself a liberal, but I think it's also generational. When I'm talking to young people, I find myself saying I have to identify myself as a progressive.
There has been a shift.
Yeah.
There's been a shift in the language.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm all for calling oneself something. On the other hand, I think what's important is the issues you stand for. Yeah. And if I had to rename what I might be, is that it's an alternativist. I'm not kidding. The belief that there are alternatives to the way our economy, our politics, our society has been constructed, and the idea that we're living with a kind of downsized politics of excluded alternatives, which is opening up some. Yeah, but there's a sense of a kind of narrow playing field, at least in Washington and in parts of this country where you have to watch what you say or kind of fall within a certain parameter of discussion.
Do you think, is there a distinction also between people who want to work through the system and believe they can really change the world by working in the electoral process, and those progressives who really think, or are they progressives who really think you have to
the book,
not do it?
The book, which is a collection of columns, as you mentioned, is fundamentally about how real change has come about in this country. And I do believe that the great transformational changes have come about from below, from people's movements through time. I mean, we can talk about the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the abolitionists. The nation was founded by abolitionists committed to ending slavery in 1865, but it's that connection, and this is where sometimes I differ with some of my left progressive colleagues. I believe you need the movements from below, but you also need political figures of principle and integrity inside.
Totally. That's what I always thought I was. I would encourage people to go out and make and do and help them. But if you don't have people inside responding, then you're not going to be able to move it.
But we are at a moment where I think partly because of the Occupy movement, I think the 99% movement is somewhat different and has the potential to move on different tracks, meaning inside, outside.
Why do you think that's different?
I think Occupy is very much a movement of moral purpose and clarity, committed to not issuing demands, and committed in some ways, many of those involved in Occupy, to dismantling a system, to looking at a system they believe is illegitimate because of the corrosion of money, because of the failure to grapple with some of the great crises of our time, like climate crisis. But some of those within Occupy also understand that you need to occupy the voting booth. And I think one of the things that Occupy in this election year may well focus on, which makes sense because of the pro-democracy piece of it, is voting rights. Mm-hmm. I think one of the central issues, I wrote a column on the morning of Iowa, where, is it Bachmann? Is it this? Is it, the horse race and everyone's going crazy? And I said, I think there are three issues to look at in this election. One is voting rights. You may see 5 million eligible voters not able to vote because of these barriers. There are 14 states which have passed voter ID laws when the fraud is that there's no real fraud, but it's very carefully targeted, as you know, at those demographics which support Democrats, African Americans, students, seniors. And I think the money in politics, the super PACs which have been unleashed since the Supreme Court decision 2 years ago, and then I'd argue the media. If you care about anything, ending poverty, ending wars, the media still defines how millions of people see reality. And the cult of false equivalence, where like a Romney will say, President Obama is waging war on the free enterprise system. And then you need someone else to reply, no, and becomes he said, she said,
Right,
as if there's some
neutral, but they're
equidistant
not.
point between
Yeah.
Jefferson and, I don't know, you know.
But, you know, basically it all comes down to every voting citizen or every citizen eligible to vote. Yeah. If they went out to vote, it might be a very totally different story about who's in state legislatures that are now passing all these laws.
It's true, though, the whole, I mean, again, in the book, I mean, there's several sections. One is like, how do we take back our
Yes.
democracy? I think seriously, this is, again, wonky, but if you had universal registration, and I believe there were
easier.
efforts to pass legislation, Michael Waldman of the Brennan Center said that could be comparable to the Voting Rights Act. The impediments to voting are extraordinary in our country, and then you have voting to participation. But I do think the inside-outside, the idea that you have the movements from outside pushing those within the system toward a politics that they might not otherwise have adopted because there's pressure from below. I mean, Roosevelt, one of the great presidents, but would he have been moved to do some of what he did? I mean, I love Frances Perkins, his first,
Right.
the Secretary of Labor, the first woman in the cabinet. But the militant labor unions in this country were more powerful, though labor's re-emerging in Wisconsin. I think, you know,
Yes.
Senator Walker, Governor Walker will be recalled because of labor's role in pushing back against the assault on collective bargaining. But Roosevelt was pushed to do various things. But there was a fascinating moment in Zuccotti Park, the park of Occupy Wall Street. I think it was in October. Reverend Jesse Jackson, interesting figure, someone whose campaign in 1988 was a movement campaign, went down to the park. He went down and saved the healthcare tent, which was very important as a very concrete commitment to that community there. But he also sat down with some of the occupiers, organizers, and said, you know, Lyndon Johnson, what do you think of when you think of Lyndon Johnson? And they said Vietnam. And he said, Voting Rights Act, you know, Medicare, Medicaid, Children's Nutrition Act, the war on poverty. And you saw in there the complex dynamic between inside, outside. And you saw it in the campaign. I don't know if you remember, I'm sure you do. Obama and Hillary got into this silly kind of sparring match. Who was more responsible for civil rights legislation, the civil rights movement, or Lyndon Johnson? Both.
Absolutely,
We needed
they
both.
do. But then we, as voters, then in '68, we, the progressive liberal community split, and some people wouldn't vote for Hubert Humphrey because he was following in the steps of Lyndon Johnson, and sharing the same agenda. Unfortunately, sharing Vietnam also, but that whole liberal thing, and that's something I think we have to be very careful about this year.
I think there is a generational cast to this year too. I think there are people like you who saw what that led to, a kind of generations of right-wing politics. Though I have to say Richard Nixon doesn't look as right-wing right now.
We all are doing back and forth.
Militantly right-wing. We've seen the country move, we've seen the Republican Party, not the country
It's
move.
moved outside the boundaries, hasn't it?
It's
just
become
moved
an extremist.
outside the ring.
It's an extremist. It's an extremist party. It has no space for those who are not. And I think it's the most militantly anti-government party. It's declared a war on science and reason. It's declared a war on labor. And by the way, Mitt Romney is no moderate. He may, you know, he too. But I do think there is a younger generation, and I write about this in the book. They came into politics with President Obama, with Barack Obama. The expectations were so great. He was the, you know, kind of walking on water, the Messiah. And he became a Rorschach for these hopes. My view is you don't invest your hopes in politicians. You don't. I mean, and you don't fall in love with politicians. And I think there was always a sense, but maybe we're too whatever at the nation, but a sense that you had to be as sort of pragmatic and clear-eyed about President Obama as he was about us. I worry about a younger generation, but I also have hope because I think there are people now who see the systemic structural problems of our system. What I hope, though, is not just the call for dismantling our system, but in dismantling our system, but in rebuilding and changing it, because I think there's a lot of feeling, and I worry about this too, when we do some tough investigative reporting, which we do, exposing the abuses of government or corporate power. When you do the government power, many people will turn off and become cynical. Look at Congress's rating right now. What is it, 84% unpopularity? My view is you cannot, the hope is you channel that cynicism and that awareness into a people's movement to take back government and reclaim it.
Right, to just get angry and say, "This, I'm not going to let this continue and I'm going to change it." But, you know, I mean, it's sort of historic that it changes all the time, doesn't it? The Republicans, though, have really gone beyond, the party has gone beyond what we have ever had, so we can't encounter it that way. But
there's a history, though, to the Tea Party, too. You know it. I mean, you see in the John Birch Society, the movement,
it's always
and the Barry
been there,
Goldwater right wing.
But
it has been hijacked. And so it's a dangerous
I like,
moment.
you know, what I thought about Occupy Wall Street is I cheered them when they had no specific agenda. And they had the broad umbrella thing, which they kept everybody together. Because I think more and more the platform of a progressive Democratic Party covered a lot of good things. But what's happened is each of those issues became itself its own body, and we forgot to pay attention to other people's issues and interests. Do you know what I'm saying?
So, I mean, I would begin by saying that Occupy Wall Street did, if it did anything, it did one extraordinary thing, which was, first of all, I would argue, capture the national imagination, capture the media imagination, and changed for too long, you know this, Ronnie, over the last 2 or 3 years, which isn't that long, but the media in this country was essentially telling us that there was one movement in this country, the Tea Party, and that it was all about debt and deficits, and that was the crisis of our time. America was broke. No, so Occupy at least broke through, and you know the story. I mean, the term income inequality in usage in the media quintupled in the month after Occupy erupted, and I think we see it every day now in our discussions. President Obama's speech in Kansas had real roots in that, and even the opportunistic discussion of vulture capitalism by these Republicans, crony Governor Rick Perry and Newt Gingrich, but it has been pushed, you know, and people are more open to that.
The trouble, though, the only troubling part about Ron Paul is that he does seem to attract a group of young people. Now, I don't know who those young people are, really. Are they people who are naturally part of the right and Republicans, or are some of our potential young people in there?
It's not just young people. I think in the exit polling out of Iowa,
everybody.
you saw Democrats and independents.
But what is the fascination with that? That just the disdain for government and the distrust of it?
I think it's deeper. I have enormous problems with Ron Paul, anyone who sort of says wouldn't support the Civil Rights Act. On the other hand, there's this kind of authenticity while you see these massaged Republican candidates, and I do think on some level, the war on drugs, I wish you wish you had a different kind of messenger, because there is, you want someone on the national scene to be saying this war on drugs has failed, or what are we doing with thousands of bases ringing the world in a national security state that isn't making us more secure?
I think that's the major thing.
So you want that discussion, and sadly, you know, Dennis Kucinich. There are a few in this progressive caucus, 90 strong in the House, which put forth a people's budget, which was really smart, and also, you know, understood that this defense budget, larger than the 10 countries combined after the United States, needed to be rethought. But Ron Paul is there. And we've basically had, you know this, I mean, I can't believe I grew up to spend Saturday nights watching Republican debate.
I know.
But there have been like 32 of these, and they become infomercials on some level, ugly ones often.
Well, that's reality TV
That's
too.
right.
That whole thing is. But what bothers me is that when you talk about Dennis Kucinich, he's considered. I mean, when you need people inside to respond to the outside, I remember in the old days, you needed to find somebody who was not expected to respond. Do you know, to give the gravity to your issue?
Well, two things. First of all, I do think you have in this progressive caucus people, I mean, you know, people like Jan Schakowsky or Keith Ellison, or Jim McGovern. These are really good people. And now you have, I would argue, the 99% candidate, Elizabeth Warren, running in Massachusetts.
We have great hopes for her, don't we?
Absolutely, and a terrific candidate in Wisconsin who has a real shot, Tammy Baldwin, who stood on the floor of the rotunda with the workers protesting Governor Walker, would be the first openly gay elected senator, speaks in economic populist terms. There's a woman in Hawaii, Mazie Hirano, who's very good. So there are people who are emerging, and I think my hope is I'm involved with some groups which are recruiting people from movements to run. There's a group called Progressive Majority, and I think that's very exciting. If you can translate that movement energy into people of integrity who are willing to make the run, whether it's for the local sheriff, the school board, and you begin to create a different momentum.
And the more victories you have, and the more colleagues, people who are been in these legislatures for a longer time, the more courage they get.
But you know, the scale of the entrenched reactionary fight back is enormous. I mean, that's what, I'm not naive. I mean, we did a story in The Nation, which was a major expose of this group called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's been around 20 years or so, funded by all the usual characters, suspects, Koch brothers and their allies. But this is a very powerful group which works with state legislators and gives them lobbyist-written legislation.
And they do it.
And you're seeing that play out now. And Bill Moyers wrote a great piece in The Nation at the end of last year, which was essentially about the 40-year right-wing march through our institutions, beginning with Lewis Powell, 2 months before he became a Supreme Court judge, sat down and did a memo for the Chamber of Commerce, which has emerged as this behemoth, about how do we take back the institutions of this country, because they were worried about Ralph Nader and the consumer crusades and the liberal uprising in that period. And now we see so much of this coming through, whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's state legislatures.
So it's a
how do
tug
we
of
fight
war.
back?
It's a tug of war between the people.
Yeah, it's organized people.
And their ability to organize the same, almost in a different way, but to counteract the pressure of these people who've organized on well, it should be the other way around.
I know.
The right and the left.
Yeah.
But I mean, the lobbyists have risen as
I had the weirdest experience this last Sunday. I was on our Washington editor, former Washington editor, Chris Hayes, has a weekend show on MSNBC. And he had on Jack Abramoff, the uber lobbyist who's now on a repentance tour because he's written a book called Capital Punishment. He's out of jail after 3.5 years, and he's talking about what he saw and what needs to be done. Like those who had been in government or in Congress should not be allowed to lobby. But, you know, he describes it, and it is what it is. It's a pay-to-play system.
Absolutely.
And, you know, people's eyes glaze over, though I think it's now emerging, like the Occupy people understood that the money corruption was fundamental to why so many are living unequally in poor communities. So, you know, I think to connect it to those issues, we got to start. We got to start, but it's going to be a long haul. This city, though, New York City, has a good. Of course, Mayor Bloomberg is not the poster boy
we
for
have
it.
a good campaign finance law, but we also have a city council that is also very a large number of members that are very responsive to the lobbyists.
Yeah.
And the problem is, they succumb to such silly things. You know, if somebody they think is important smiles at them. I remember when Donald Trump was doing a Riverside South, and somebody held up his book and it was autographed to him, and he got a phone call from Donald Trump. And that was enough to get the vote.
Well, there we need spinal transplants.
But you know, that's what's changing, I think, because it used to be, I used to say, if you're rich, you must be smart. That's what they all thought. Nowadays, though, it's beginning. That's what I think Operation Occupy Wall Street has helped to do.
But it still doesn't help the fact that I remember Sherrod Brown, good senator from Ohio, when he was a congressman, he came to say hi. He was going to meet Chuck Schumer, and he needed to raise, Sherrod Brown did, to run the Senate race. This was 10 years ago, $20,000 a week. You know, you're going to see self-funding candidates, and then you see what we saw, the report in the Times about the growing wealth gap between members of Congress and ordinary people, because a lot of it is the cost of campaigning. You need friends who have money.
And then we have this horrible decision from the Supreme Court, which has affected everything.
But people are mobilizing. I think you got to first get angry, then you get passionate, then you get mobilized. It's a little, you know, it's never too late. I wish it had come sooner, but I think there's a sense of, you know, organizing and mobilizing.
So he went to see Chuck Schumer because Chuck Schumer had available he had the connections to get the money?
You know the story.
This is the senator from New York State.
There are 5
that
zip codes in this country
Yes.
that produce most of the campaign money. One of them is 10021,
Yeah.
and 3 of them I think are in the city
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
So I think until you find a way that 99% people are supporting the candidates with small donations.
Yeah.
And Obama, by the way, was a strange mixture because in 2008,
He had
he
so
showed the
much.
way with small donations, which was exciting. And Elizabeth Warren's doing that as well. But he also, of course, was taking big money.
The Obama campaign, which you start your book with, first 100 days, and then you go through the different times. It's interesting because I've explained to you I'm so loyal that I can't stand criticizing, and of course I think he should be reelected, and I think he will be reelected, and not by a small amount. But anyway, they built all these young people and everybody organizing, and we did our own bit too in a local little organization. But everybody felt that we had helped elect him. So then they take that whole campaign structure and they keep these young people in different states and they're organizing. But their mistake was, I think, and I agree with you, they told these people what to do. And they didn't come back and reinforce and build it up.
It's a major theme of my book. And I mean, you can be a pragmatic president, a pragmatic progressive, but to be a pragmatist, you know you need a wind at your back, a countervailing power to counter the forces of entrenched corporate establishment, status quo, money and power. And I think you had that possibility because it was in many ways, not fully, a kind of movement campaign. So not only do you demobilize, you demoralize.
Yeah, it was not smart. They lost people, and and they've tended to do that. I mean, but you're right. It's a Rorschach test, and we looked and everybody saw what they wanted to see. He never made great promises that he was going to, except that he was going to end the war in Iraq and bring troops home. But he never said that about Afghanistan, and
Well, I would talk to my colleagues who,
and
I'd
say,
when they
watch
would
that
after
out.
he was elected, and they'd go, "Oh," I said,
Yeah.
"Did you listen?" I went to an event where he talked about ending the war in Iraq so we could fight the good war.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know, but a lot of people didn't want to hear. And also, he came to national fame. You know this in 2004 at the convention with the red. The thing I don't get, and I did have a chance. There was an off-the-record meeting with the president. I'd met him as a candidate. The first thing he said to me when he learned I was editor of The Nation was, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And I don't disagree.
Yeah.
But I also felt, and I wrote about this, you don't lead with compromise. There is room for compromise.
But you think
the
you
art
gave
of the
it too early.
possible. Well, I wondered why you come to Washington, you want to change Washington, which can mean many different things. It can be the wonky thing of changing a filibuster, which was more abused in 2009 than entire 1950s, 60s. Or it can be cleaning up Washington in tough ways. But you come to Washington, you're going to play kumbaya politics. But after 6 months of looking in the eyes of Senator DeMint and McConnell, who have stated openly that their first priority is to take you down, maybe plan B.
But
and my final thought, putting aside Afghanistan, was the tone deafness. Now, the panic at the end of that campaign with the financial crisis, which wasn't his, but he inherited. But to bring in a Timothy Geithner and a Lawrence Summers, I mean, bring in at least, as he promised, President Obama did promise, as Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote about, bring in, remember the team of rivals?
Yeah.
Where was a Robert Reich or, a Stiglitz or someone, who could have been a different voice and at least.
I agree with you. That was terrible.
And it opened the door, I think, to the Tea Party. Because even though they were complicit and a lot of their people voted for the bank bailouts, there was a sense of Wall Street dominating at a moment when the need to restructure, not resuscitate.
I've always, the big financing of campaigns, of course, is a major thing. And nowadays, with the television and the money, none of the political candidates need really, except when they have a primary or something in a state, to pay attention to the other states so much. Well, New York, for instance, New York. Right. We have nothing as far as organization and ground troops. There's no place for anybody who doesn't have a lot of money, basically, to volunteer, unless you have that strong will to do something.
Well, if you're talking nationally, you mean nationally?
Well, I don't know about other states, so I'm assuming some states that's true.
On a president, you mean?
Yeah.
Part of the problem, this is, and again, I write about this in the book, the Electoral College. Our votes don't matter. You got an election, national election, which essentially ends up being 19 states, 20, and
Yeah.
18, the battleground states. So if you live in Wisconsin, you're going to see an ad every 2 seconds. New York, our vote doesn't
Yeah.
matter. And so there are good people
it's
trying
too
to
bad.
make that change. There's
Yeah.
something called the national popular vote.
Right.
So it would
But the founding fathers, which are quoted so often,
Often,
all the
I
time.
know.
And, you
But
know,
think about the southern states. We're
Yeah.
heading into a primary in South Carolina.
yeah.
First of all, it's a state with the 6th highest, I believe, level of poverty in this country. The issue of poverty, which I know you've worked on. We just started a poverty blog at The Nation.
You don't hear about poor people.
We're beginning
We
to, again,
do now,
Occupy
we
is
are,
beginning.
yes.
The income inequality, the downward mobility.
But
and
up
I think,
until then, you have not heard about poor people.
and I do think the Democratic Party, in good ways, but has been largely about the middle class. President Obama, again, they really mastered the art of communication in the campaign. They admit they have not in governing. But you know, the recovery program was needed to avert a depression. It was also the largest net investment of any poverty fund since the Great Society. They didn't want to claim that. But you're beginning now, I think, because the middle class is so squeezed and downward mobility, and that's such a theme of Occupy Wall Street, to see at least more attention to
We're
the
giving
poor.
him more support now. We're pulling more from the outside, so we hopefully we're going to get some response that's going to be different this time. Don't you
But
think?
South Carolina
It's-
is off out of play. You have a large African American population, but essentially its vote won't matter because of the Electoral College, and the Republicans could just dominate that part of the country, the South, for generations to come, unless there's some way to reopen the whole structural.
So we're coming to the end of this program. I can't believe it, and it's too bad. But your columns, that a lot of them are in this book, appear on the internet. They're online. So they're on WashingtonPost.com
Right.
and
And
TheNation.com.
TheNation.com.
And it's a blog and columns, right? I mean,
You know,
do you
there-
blog so much? What is it? I don't
The
even know.
difference is a blog is much more just a quick interjection,
yeah,
maybe
but you're-
linked to a video. I'm really doing a blog,
blog.
and I'm a column, a web
Yeah,
column.
right.
And I think part of what's going on with media now is the question is how are we going to support quality journalism?
Yeah.
That's part of our mission at The Nation. To be honest, the magazine remains the anchor, the print magazine. But if you can do quality journalism on these different platforms, the problem is there's a lot of junk.
Yeah. Next time we'll do that, all right?
Yes.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
Katrina.
Thank you.
Is there any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore? Please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.